Thousands rally across Israel against violence, homophobia and hatred. They're condemning last week's attack on Jerusalem's gay pride parade and the firebombing that burned a Palestinian baby to death. We ask if Israeli society has failed to confront its own intolerance. This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. A 1.5-year-old Palestinian infant burned to death. A 15-year-old girl stabbed by an ultra-Orthodox Jew at a gay pride parade. Two attacks that brought thousands of people onto the streets in protest. And Israel's president says shamed the country.
Flames have spread across our country. Flames of violence, flames of hatred, flames of false beliefs, distorted and twisted. Flames that have allowed bloodshed in the name of the Bible, in the name of Jewish law, in the name of morals, in the name of love for the state of Israel.
Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu too offered strong words of condemnation. Speaking after a cabinet meeting on Sunday, he pledged zero tolerance for all kinds of extremism.
In the past few days, we have witnessed two despicable crimes. Our policy towards these crimes is zero tolerance. I've instructed the security service and law enforcement authorities to act with all the legal means at their disposal to catch the murderers and to bring the stabber and the arsonist to justice. We are determined to fight vehemently against this phenomena of hatred, extremism, and terror from any quarter.
But Palestinians say the words of Israeli politicians like the Prime Minister are contradicted by the facts on the ground, that the arson attack in the occupied West Bank is a byproduct of this government's policy of settlement expansion, and unless that root cause is stopped and reversed, these kinds of crimes will happen again. All right, let's bring in our guests on this discussion. First of all, in Jerusalem, Jeremy Saltan, Knesset insider and contributor on Voice of Israel. In Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, a columnist for Haaretz newspaper and author of the book The Punishment of Gaza. And also in Jerusalem, Sahar Vardi, a Jerusalem activist and organizer at Free Jerusalem. Welcome to the three of you. Important issue to discuss here, of course. And Jeremy Saltan, if I can start with you in Jerusalem. Of course, intolerance is there at some level in all societies. Do you believe it's getting worse in Israel?
We had two isolated incidents that coincidentally did happen within 24 hours of each other. And there have been attempts by a lot of people to try to connect this with the religious Israelis or the right-wing Israelis, but I reject those claims. The first attack took place in, of course, the gay pride parade in Jerusalem. Of course, a gay pride parade happening in the Middle East, in Israel, something that you're not exactly seeing in other cities such as Ramallah, Tehran, or perhaps Baghdad or Damascus. And the attacker is a person who's known to Israeli authorities. It's the same attacker who stabbed participants at the gay pride parade 10 years ago and just got released a few weeks ago after a 10-year sentence. If anything, I think specifically with the first attack, it's really the courts who have to ask themselves how it is that after a person commits a hate crime, he can get out after only 10 years.
Now, of course, your president would disagree with you. I suggest that you're saying, it seems that you're saying that intolerance hasn't got worse in Israel, but your president would disagree with you, saying that the flames of hatred are spreading across Israel. He warned that an atmosphere of leniency towards extremism has taken root within Israeli society.
I'm going to disagree with President Rivlin on this. Again, if you have the same person who stabbed participants at a gay pride parade 10 years ago, he gets out of jail. A few weeks later, he stabs again. I don't know how you can go ahead and connect that to anything that's happened over the last 10 years. This is obviously a person who's acting as an individual who's done so beforehand and has not exactly been out on the streets to go ahead and hear the so-called incitement.
Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv, how do you stand on this?
It's very easy for the Israeli propaganda to present each of those two horrible cases as cases, individual crazy people who took a knife or a Molotov bottle and decided to take lives of others. But this is obviously taking things out of context, because there is a context, a very clear context of growing violence, nationalism, racism in Israel, mainly among the settlers, mainly among the national religious camp. All the political murders and violence comes only from this camp and always from this camp. And this camp got legitimization throughout the years. I must remind you that this house that was burned on Friday morning, early in the morning, is the 9th house that is being burned in the last 3 years by settlers. Only luck made the difference, or bad luck, or terrible bad luck, made the difference between this case and former cases in which there were no casualties, but the tendency is there. Israel never had any intention to bring those people to justice, and the fact is that all the 9 cases, nobody was brought to justice. And now you get the outcome, but you can take it in a much more broader scale. Israel killed 500 children in Gaza last year, and it wasn't even an issue in Israel.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, we're going to move on to that in a little while. But let me just say that, first of all, the Prime Minister has spoken out. He's been quite clear in his condemnation of this crime, hasn't he? Saying that there will be zero tolerance against this kind of crime.
That's very nice and very touching, but it's too little and too late. Because where were you before? When the issue of the life of Palestinians is a non-issue in Israeli society, you come up all of a sudden after such a horrible case, and then you say all those condemnations. It's very touching, but it is not much more than hypocrisy, because they know very well that those cases didn't start yesterday, and the government and the police and the Secret Service did nothing to bring those people to justice. Now they will, no doubt, now they will. But all this has a much broader cultural, social and political background, and this background is exactly the same background that makes Netanyahu a prime minister in Israel.
Okay, so Vadi, you were at that gay pride march. How do you see the context of this?
Well, I do think that it's very much connected. The reason that our President Rivlin kept using the word flame for what's happening right now is not random. It has to do, among other things, with a specific group of extreme right-wings, call themselves Flame Lehava, who have been the same people who on the one hand are chasing down Palestinians in city centre Jerusalem and beating them up, and at the same time they've been the people organising protests against the gay pride parade, and there is a very clear right-wing, extreme right-wing ideology of a group of people who believe in using violence to serve their ideology, which is both racist and homophobic. Now, I'm not saying that these people are specifically the people who carried out any of these actions. Obviously, the person who stabbed at Gay Pride also did the same thing 10 years ago, and you can't lay all the responsibility on them. But I can say that that kind of rhetoric and the fact that they make that rhetoric legitimate, and that they make city centre Jerusalem a place where where you can say racist things, where you can say homophobic things, that does give them responsibility for the next stabbing, who might not be someone who did it also 10 years ago. And for me, that's very worrying as someone who lives in the city. And I saw it yesterday as well. We were, after the protest yesterday, condemning both acts of violence. We had youth coming and screaming homophobic things at us, youth that are part of Lehava, part of this organisation.
Jeremy Saltan, do you want to come back to that?
Sure. Again, in case it isn't clear, I condemn both acts of violence. Again, if it isn't clear, there's not one Israeli official, coalition or opposition that supported either attack. You've had wall-to-wall condemnation. There's no person that is sane or normal in this country that's giving us support to anything in terms of calling for violence. And unfortunately, some of the things we heard from the people before me are indicating that there are such calls. There are no calls for violence, not from any public official, not from anyone except for maybe a very, very fringe extremist group of people. You know, both attacks were carried out on the Jewish holiday called Tu B'Av. That's our Valentine's Day. It's the festival of love. No one can go ahead and tell me that somebody who goes ahead and kills a baby or goes ahead and stabs people in the middle of downtown Jerusalem is doing that in the name of God on the Festival of Love. I'm sorry, I don't buy that.
Again, some very prominent people disagree with you. The former President Shimon Peres blames your Prime Minister for creating this atmosphere of incitement. He says he who incites against Arab citizens of Israel should not be surprised when churches and mosques are burned down, and in the end, a baby is burned alive in his sleep.
Again, I'm trying to understand, is the former President and Prime Minister Shimon Peres going ahead and determining that the Prime Minister of Israel is directly responsible for either of those attacks? It's very hard for me to go ahead and share that type of logic. There's nothing that you can play in terms of a soundbite that can bring anything remotely close to that. I'm very disappointed that there are unfortunately, there are very many people.
Well, on the eve of the, it may not be to that extreme, but on the eve of the election, he disavowed, Netanyahu disavowed Palestinian statehood, saying that Arab citizens were heading to the polls in their droves, which was deemed by some to be a racist remark.
He didn't call to burn. He didn't call to burn houses. He didn't call to burn houses. He didn't call to go ahead and burn babies and kill babies. That's not what the Prime Minister said. And again, we have a situation where there was a protest in Tel Aviv, a rally of support for the LGBT community. Unfortunately, they did not let anybody from the right-wing religious party of Bayit Yehudi speak. They told Naftali Bennett, the education minister, to turn around. They did not let Yinon Megal, another member of Knesset, speak. Yuval Steinitz, a member of Netanyahu's party, he was the one who ended up getting booed. You had a activist of the Yesh Atid party who ended up being assaulted, and that's not even a right-wing party. I think tolerance works both ways, and you have to also be able to respect the opinions of people, even if they happen to disagree with you.
Okay, Gideon Levy, it's true to say that the huge majority of Israelis would be against these terrible crimes, but how involved do you think the society is as a whole in this level of intolerance?
No doubt that any Israeli was shocked Friday from both terrible cases. That's not a question at all. Who cannot be shocked by burning? By the way, it's not burning a baby. It's a whole family which was burnt and is now struggling on their lives. It's his parents, his brother. It's not only one baby. It's a whole family which was exterminated. And in any case, everyone is shocked from this. But you know, I have to come back to the broader context, because the same society was totally indifferent just 1 year ago when 500 children were killed by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces. Out of them, tens and tens of babies which were burned under the bombs of the Israeli Air Force. Then I didn't hear any kind of condemnation or shock or even questions. Was it necessary? Was it proportional? Was it legal? Nothing. It wasn't an issue at all. So if this is the attitude toward the lives of Palestinians, now to pretend as if you are so shocked by burning one baby, that's really cheap hypocrisy, which I cannot buy. I'm very sorry.
Okay, Jeremy Saltan, you just 30 seconds to come back to that.
Sure. We had a war last summer. Maybe Gidon Levy forgot, but they went ahead, they kidnapped 3 kids. They brutally murdered them. They started throwing rockets on all of Israel. Most of the Israelis ended up in bomb shelters for the course of the summer. And in war, unfortunately, you do have, unfortunately, people who die, and that includes also, unfortunately, civilians, and that also means kids. But the difference between us and Hamas, the terrorist organization that we were fighting, is that we're trying to protect our children, and they're putting their children on the front lines to protect themselves.
Sahar Vardi, let's take this on. I'm just interested to understand who the protesters on the streets represent and to what degree there may be divisions within the country. Does it make a difference, say, in Tel Aviv or further south as to how people feel about these issues?
Well, obviously different cities are very different, and while in Tel Aviv it's much more a consensus issue, in Jerusalem it's something that we literally are fighting to stay in the streets. I'm talking not only about having gay pride in Jerusalem as something that, you know, that there's counter-protests every year, there's threats of attacks every year, and it's also something that in daily life. You walk around as a same-sex couple, and you will be at least cursed, if not also pushed around. So this is something that is very different between different cities, and in Jerusalem is part of our daily reality. But I do just want for a second to go back to what Jeremy was saying before about incitement and about the fact that Israeli politicians, obviously everybody's condemning this and nobody's telling anyone to burn babies or to stab protesters. That said, nobody's saying that, but you do have politicians, for instance, from Habayit Yehudi, like Ben Dahan, that say that the life of a Jew will always be worth more than a life of a non-Jew, even if that Jew is gay, which in one sentence manages to create a very clear hierarchy between different people, if they're Jewish or not, or if they're gay or straight. And so, no, he might not be saying, please stab these people, but that kind of language is obviously something that in the end affects people, and unfortunately can affect people into a very violent reality as well. And I think it's really important to remember that. It's important to remember that when Netanyahu goes ahead and condemns burning this family and the death of this baby, at the same time, when he went to the hospital to visit the family, he didn't even bring an interpreter to translate him into Arabic, and he couldn't even speak to the family, because honestly, I mean, and the only way I can interpret that is that he doesn't really care, that he condemns it because that's what you're supposed to do. And it's very clear today in the political spectrum that you have to condemn both these actions, and everybody's doing it, even the right wing, but it doesn't change the fact that their actual actions, if it's very extremely homophobic remarks on the one hand, or if it's continuing a system of occupation that keeps killing Palestinians on a regular basis. I mean, just this week, 2 other kids were killed in clashes with, Palestinian kids were killed in clashes with Israelis, with Israeli forces, and that's something that we're not talking about. So it's very nice to take, you know, the most extreme cases of violence and say, oh, we're against that, and it's, you know, those crazy people, and try to get responsibility off of your hands. But the reality is that this is the system we're living in.
Yeah, you mentioned there the political spectrum, and Gideon, I just want to come to you on that. To what degree do you think crimes like this affect the political arena, the political sphere between Arabs and Israelis?
Obviously, they don't contribute to the coexistence or the understanding or to peace. I think that for the short run, people, or at least part of the society, is shocked. And it might be, in a way, a wake-up call for at least part of the society, which must understand that as long as the settlement project is going on, those cases will be there. It's part and parcel of occupation, part and parcel of Israeli brutality in the occupied territories, part and parcel of the crime which is called the Israeli occupation. That's the main crime. But I think as time will go on, will pass by, people will get back to their old beliefs and thoughts and fears and ideology. And I don't think that it will have a major effect on the way
so
that
what
people
will have a major effect?
perceive
What will have a major effect? What do they need to do? Do they need to teach tolerance in schools, for example?
I'm very skeptical because I think that the brainwash system in Israel is so deep-rooted. The wrong values are so deep-rooted, nationalism, the belief that we are the chosen people and we have the right to do whatever we want. Those values are so deeply rooted. The dehumanization of the Palestinians and the Arabs in general is so deep that I don't see any change coming from within the Israeli society. The change will have to come, unfortunately so, only by an international intervention, an intervention which will remind the Israelis that this status quo is unaccepted by the world and will not go on.
Jeremy Saltan, are you totally satisfied that the level of tolerance in Israel is acceptable, that despite these crimes, nothing needs to be done?
I think in general we can always look to improve in many areas, and that's definitely one of them. But again, I reject the claims.
Let's just home in on that. So when you say that's definitely one of them, what do you mean by that?
Travesties that we had.
Let's just home in on that. When you say that's definitely one of them, the area of intolerance. Just explain more on that.
Sure, I think there's many issues that we could work as an Israeli society to open ourselves up more and try to improve on. I think any society that says we don't need to work on ourselves is a society that's in trouble. So, yeah, I think it's always nice to go ahead and see what we can do. And I think this is one issue where we can do that. But again, it suggests that these two travesties, that these two isolated incidents are the reason that we should do that. Again, it's very hard for me to do that because, again, the first crime was committed by a person who committed it 10 years before. And it's my feeling that when we find the person or people that committed the second crime, we're going to find out that they probably also spent time behind bars. And the suggestion that, again, that all of this has to do with something that's happening on the Israeli government side. Just today, there was an OECD report released.
Listen, let me, before we go on another tangent, it's true to say, as we're coming to the end of the program, if you look at the pictures of the marches and the protests yesterday, that you sound like a lone voice within the country because an awful lot of people disagree with you and were out in the streets yesterday. And briefly, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Like I said, there were other people who try to show to the big rally in Tel Aviv and really voice a different opinion. Unfortunately, they were not allowed to. The people who did try ended up getting booed and they did not make the news cycle. There are other voices. It's not just the ones dominating the media right now.
So, Vadi, which direction do you think Israel needs to go now on this?
Well, I think that education is really important, but on the other hand, it's very hard for the Minister of Education to say we should have more education that's tolerant to LGBTQ and at the same time have people in his party who are outspoken homophobes and have no problem admitting that. And the same goes to when we talk about racism. It's great to have education around being anti-racist, but then if your whole school system prepares young Israelis for military service, well, they'll have to implement an occupation, then it's really, you're contradicting yourself constantly. So as far as I'm concerned, if we really want to kind of deal with these core issues, then Israel needs to change from the core, and that does include obviously ending the occupation, but also ending a lot of different mechanisms of discrimination that we have within the society, and then we can start talking about tolerance and about education and the value of that.
And Gideon, just to wrap up, you mentioned earlier this fact that a lot of people hadn't been prosecuted in the past for crimes that they had committed, and had they jailed these so-called price tag criminals, i.e. price paid for action against the settlements, in the same way they do those in the Arab territories, do you think we would have seen a different response in the days as far as tolerance is concerned?
No, because as I said before, the context is much broader. I mean, it would be much better if those people would have been brought to justice, not only in terms of preventing them to continue their crimes, but also as a message to the others. But by and large, by the end of the day, let's remember that as long as this brutal occupation is going on, this is inevitable, and it will just get worse and worse. Because a brutal illegal occupation calls for this kind of violence by smaller groups, obviously. But when the big notion is of lives of Palestinians is worth nothing, then everyone takes it to its own direction, and the extremists take it to their own direction and throw Molotov bottles into private homes. That's their interpretation. But by the end of the day, catching them will not stop anything. What will really stop it is only putting an end to the occupation, no other way.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. There's a long way to go with this discussion, as ever with these issues, but we appreciate your participation. Gideon Levy, thanks very much indeed. Also in Jerusalem, Jeremy at Saltan and Saha Vadi. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you for watching. Always keen to hear from you. Just get in touch via our program page on aljazeera.com or post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can just tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team, it's goodbye.